Now from Bristol is Tony Gosling, investigative journalist, for more on the story. Hey there, Tony. Hope you're safe and sound. Always a pleasure to check in with you. So far from home, so much claim to ocean so far from home, both by Washington and London. Your thoughts on what's going on with these permanent out of the UK?
Well, certainly it's a provocation by the British. Absolutely no excuse for it, really, as far as I can see. It's the idea of protecting British power over to the South China Sea. It's very much like the Chinese sailing battleships, aircraft carriers up and down the River Thames. It's not really, the idea is not to be friendly to your foreign power. It's actually quite a provocative thing to do. But we have to also look at the rights and wrongs of the way that law of the sea operates. Now, every piece of sea, if it's close to a country, is obviously of strategic value. And the way that the law of the sea operates is, and this is the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, is that 15 miles, that's 12 nautical miles of the coast, is your territory, and nobody's allowed to come within that, because that's considered to be a potential strike distance away from the country. Now, for example, in Britain, that means you can navigate around Britain, go around the UK, but you can't come too close. And that's a very sensible way of doing things, I think. And that what's happened with the South China Sea, to turn it into the problem that it's become, is that China has started to create these artificial islands. And those artificial islands have been extending and extending Chinese influence around that part of the world. Now, the South China Sea is no more Chinese than the Indian Ocean is Indian. And so this is an attempt to that law of the sea limit. But the thing is, the Article 60 and Article 80 in the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea absolutely and categorically exclude artificially created islands. And so there is a legal grey area here. But if you look at the law of the sea, it's saying, well, China is doing this deliberately to extend its power, and therefore the law of the sea. So anyway, the British, I think, are just simply part of the US strategy to have a confrontation with China. If anyone remembers, about 3 years ago, John Pilger came out with a brilliant documentary, maybe 4 years ago actually, called The Coming War on China. And his prognosis, I think, was absolutely spot on. Brilliant journalist, hardly ever seen or heard in the at all, even though he's one of the greatest journalists there's ever been. And The Coming War on China explains that the West, it looks like it's losing the economic war, and so it's going to go towards a much more provocative potential shooting war in order to try and intimidate China. There's another side to all of this, of course, and that is that the US has bases, and the British actually, but more the US, all around the world. The Chinese don't do that. Their bases are close to home. And so there's another mismatch there. So this is really just, I think, a provocation by the British, and I don't think there's any excuse for spending British taxpayers' money on sending carrier strike forces halfway around the world to get involved in a fight they can't possibly win.
And Tony, a lot of rhetoric lately, anti-China rhetoric. We saw it from the G7. We've seen it from the United Nations. Where's it all supposed to lead to?
Well, this is a good point, because I think, as I said, it's more to do with really just trying to intimidate China. This is the way I think that the US deals with most of even its allies, actually. There's a lot of intimidation goes on. For example, the British recently and the Americans have left Afghanistan, and there was quite a lot of British equipment, including helicopters, that had been left over in Afghanistan. And although this was never really said in the news, many of us commentators, looking at the fact that it was the Russian heavy lifting aircraft that brought those helicopters back to Britain rather than the Americans, would assume that the Americans had actually declined to do it for the British, and actually that the British had to go, well, if you're not going to have to go and talk to the Russians. So, there's a lot of intimidation, and the Americans, it doesn't seem to me, will do anything for their so-called allies unless they're going to get something back in return. So, of course, that's really an abusive relationship that Britain is having to put up with from the United States. And I think, we've put up with it for far too long. Personally, with all these US troops all over this lovely country of ours, we would like them actually to go home. It's actually mainly aircraft and air bases. So they're just extending this arrogance arrogant, I think, attitude, which is saying that we can just project power anywhere we want, and it's particularly sour grapes, isn't it? When the Americans have basically failed to produce a good manufacturing industry, that their rackets that they run in their country mean that actually produce and sell goods on the international markets at a sensible price, because they're trying to take far too much in profits. The real estate prices in the United States, the energy prices, the water prices, everything is costing too much for ordinary people. So that means that when they're working in factories to produce things, those people are having to pay absolutely masses in their wages to these various rackets around them. So there's no way. The Chinese don't do that. The Chinese make sure that their citizens are paying minimal amounts for these basic requirements of life, including housing, this sort of thing. So the Americans are bound to lose this trade war, and they can see the end coming for US domination of world trade, for the dollar to be dominating through the petrodollar. They can see that. And so they're going around finding whoever it is that's beaten them at their own capitalist game and sticking their finger in the face, which is exactly why the British are doing this. This is really something I think the British are doing for the Americans, rather than, the British are doing it off their own back. They're trying to gain favours with the great world empire that, we are now their little puppy dogs.
Always a pleasure, pleasure to check in with you, Tony. We always learn so much. Thank you, and stay safe. From Bristol, that was Tony Gosling there. You bet. Investigative journalist joining us.